Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're jumping straight into a really fascinating part of Scripture.
We are.
We're looking at 1 Corinthians chapter 7, and this one, it really gets into some personal stuff, relationships, singleness, marriage.
Divorce too. And how to live faithfully when the world feels a bit chaotic or uncertain.
Exactly. And it feels very direct, doesn't it? Like advice written for real people facing real situations back then.
Absolutely. It's not just theology in the clouds. It's addressing specific questions from the Corinthian community. But wow, the themes still hit home today.
Okay, so let's dive in. Right at the start, verses 1 and 2, we get this line, "It is good for a man not to marry." That sounds pretty strong, a preference.
It does seem like a preference, yeah. Maybe rooted in this idea of avoiding worldly entanglements. To allow for perhaps a clearer focus on spiritual matters, it definitely positions singleness as, well, good.
But then, like, in the very next breath, there's this big but.
Right.
But since there's so much immorality, each man should have his own wife, and each woman her own husband.
And that's the balance, isn't it? It's acknowledging the reality, the pressures and temptations within that community.
Yeah.
Marriage is presented as, like you said before, a
A
safeguard.
safeguard. Okay. The right place for sexual expression, basically.
Exactly. Protecting people from temptation outside that specific relationship.
And it moves quickly from just get married to how to be married. Verses 3 to 5 talk about mutual obligation, fulfilling the marital duty.
And the mutuality there is honestly quite striking for its time. It says the husband owes this duty to his wife, and importantly, likewise the wife to her husband.
Yeah, that likewise is key.
It is. And then it goes even deeper. The wife's body does not belong to her alone, but also to her husband. In the same way, the husband's body does not belong to him alone, but also to his wife. That's really something. Equal vulnerability, equal giving.
So not just duty, but shared belonging in a way.
Precisely.
And then there's the instruction not to deprive one another, except by mutual agreement for prayer and only for a time.
Right. And the reason given is very practical. Come back together so Satan won't tempt you because of a lack of self-control. It recognizes human frailty.
Okay, then in verses 6 to 9, the tone seems to shift a little. The author says, "I say this as a concession, not as a command." What's that distinction about?
Well, it's crucial. He's clarifying that what he just said, perhaps about marriage being the norm due to immorality or maybe the advice about temporary abstinence, is permitted or suggested wisdom for their situation, not an absolute direct command from the Lord himself applicable in all circumstances.
Got it. It's guidance, not rigid law.
Yes. And then he adds his personal wish, doesn't he? I wish that all men were as I am, meaning unmarried.
Yeah, but he immediately adds, but each man has his own gift from God. One has this gift, another has that.
And that's huge. It frames singleness not as lacking something, but as a specific gift, a spiritual gift, just like marriage is understood to be a gift. Different callings, both valid.
So his advice flows from that. To the unmarried and the widows, he says, it is good for them to stay unmarried as I am.
Makes sense if it's a gift. But then, again, the practical reality check in verse 9.
Right. But if they cannot control themselves, they should marry, for it is better to marry than to burn with passion.
Which does highlight one function of marriage being discussed here. Providing a godly outlet for sexual desire to avoid being consumed by unmet passion. It's very grounded advice.
Okay, shifting gears to verses 10 through 16. Now it's advice for the married, and the language gets stronger. To the married, I give this command, not I, but the Lord.
Yeah, notice the shift in authority claim there.
A wife must not separate from her husband, and a husband must not divorce his wife.
This seems to directly echo teachings attributed to Jesus about the permanence of marriage, specifically between two believers. Divorce is strongly discouraged, commanded against.
But life happens, so he addresses separation. But if she does separate, she must remain unmarried or else be reconciled to her husband.
So even if believers separate, the options are limited, according to this text. Reconciliation or remaining single, not remarriage to someone else.
Now, the really complex bit. Mixed faith marriages, starting around verse 12. And here he says again, to the rest I say this I, not the Lord.
Right, back to his apostolic judgment, not quoting a direct command from Jesus for this specific scenario.
So if a believer has an unbelieving spouse who wants to stay married, the advice is, don't divorce them.
Yes, prioritize keeping the marriage intact if the unbeliever is willing. And the reason given is fascinating, this idea of sanctification.
Verse 14. For the unbelieving husband has been sanctified through his wife, And the unbelieving wife has been sanctified through her believing husband. Otherwise, your children would be unclean, but as it is, they are holy. What does sanctified or holy mean here?
Well, it likely doesn't mean the unbeliever is automatically saved. It's more like the believer's presence brings the household, including the spouse and children, into a sphere of God's blessing or special consideration. It sets them apart. It creates a positive spiritual environment.
Okay, that makes sense. But what if the unbeliever doesn't want to stay? Verse 15.
Ah, yes, the exception. But if the unbeliever leaves, let him do so.
And then this phrase. A believing man or woman is not bound in such circumstances. God has called us to live in peace. What does not bound imply?
That's the million-dollar question, really. Many scholars interpret "not bound" here as meaning released from the marriage bond, and therefore free to remarry, unlike the case of two believers separating. The key is the unbeliever initiating the split,
Right.
and the goal shifts to peace for the believer.
Rather than staying in a conflict-ridden situation just because.
Exactly. Peace seems to be a higher value in that specific scenario.
And it ends that section with a kind of sobering question in verse 16, doesn't it?
It does.
How do you know, wife, whether you will save your husband? Or how do you know, husband, whether you will save your wife?
It's a touch of realism, perhaps. A reminder that while you hope and pray, you can't force conversion. Staying married isn't a guaranteed evangelism strategy for your spouse. It puts the responsibility back on God, maybe.
Okay, pulling back for a moment, verses 17 to 24 seem to lay out a broader principle that ties some of this together.
Yes, this is really key.
Each one should retain the place in life that the Lord assigned to him and to which God has called him. And he calls this his rule in all the churches.
This is a major theme. Contentment, or perhaps better, faithfulness within the situation you were in when God called you. Your calling to faith happens in your existing life context.
And he gives examples, right? Circumcision, verse 18. If you were called circumcised, stay that way. Uncircumcised, don't change it.
Because, as verse 19 says, those outward markers are nothing. What matters is keeping God's commands. Your relationship with God transcends these external things.
And the same logic applies to social status, slave or free, in verses 20-23.
Right. Were you a slave when you were called? Don't let it trouble you. Which is easy to say. Harder to live, surely.
For sure, but the point seems to be about identity.
Exactly. For he who was a slave when called is the Lord's freedman. Similarly, he who was free when called is Christ's slave. Your ultimate identity, your true status, is transformed by your relationship with Christ.
And that line, you were bought at a price, do not become slaves of men. Powerful.
It reframes everything. Worldly status becomes secondary to this new reality in Christ. So, verse 24 summarizes, stay in the situation God called you to, living responsibly before him in that situation.
Okay, so with that principle in mind, he then circles back to specifics in verses 25 to 31, talking about virgins, likely unmarried young people. And again, I have no command from the Lord, but I give a judgment.
Yep, confirming again, this is his inspired counsel for their specific time and place.
And the reason for this counsel is critical. Because of the present crisis, I think that it is good for you to remain as you are.
This present crisis, we don't know exactly what it was, persecution, famine, strong belief the end times are imminent. But whatever it was, it created a sense of urgency that heavily influences the advice.
So the advice is pretty stark. Married, don't seek divorce. Unmarried, don't look for a wife.
Very focused, driven by that crisis context. But notice, he immediately clarifies in verse 28.
Right. Marrying isn't a sin. If you marry, you have not sinned.
Marriage itself is still good and permissible. The issue isn't marriage being bad. It's the timing and the circumstances.
Because, as he warns, again, quite bluntly, but those who marry will face many troubles in this life, and I want to spare you this.
See, it connects directly back to the crisis. Marriage brings wonderful things, but also inherent worldly cares, responsibilities, potential anxieties, family, provision, etc. In a time of great external trouble or crisis, adding those internal marriage-related troubles might just be too much. He wants to spare them that extra burden then.
Which leads into those really striking verses, 29 to 31, explaining the why behind this attitude.
The time is short.
This world in its present form is passing away. That perspective changes everything, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. It leads to this call for a kind of detachment. Living in the world, but not being fully defined or consumed by it.
Yeah, live as if you weren't married, even if you are. Mourn as if you weren't mourning. Buy as if you didn't possess. Use the world, but don't be engrossed in it.
It's radical. It really makes you question how tightly we hold on to our current circumstances, relationships, possessions, emotions, especially if we believe the world as we know it is temporary. How should that belief shape our engagement now?
So the motivation for preferring singleness in that crisis becomes even clearer in verses 32 to 35. He wants them free from concern.
Exactly. And he contrasts the concerns directly. The unmarried person can focus on the Lord's affairs, how he can please the Lord, aiming for that undivided devotion.
Whereas the married person naturally has concerns about the affairs of this world, how he can please his wife, husband. Their interests are divided.
It's not saying those worldly concerns are bad. Pleasing your spouse is good, but it is a division of focus. Singleness, in his view for that time, offered a unique potential for single-minded focus on God.
And he stresses his motive. For your own good, not to restrict you, but that you may live in a right way in undivided devotion to the Lord.
It's about facilitating a particular kind of devotion he sees as especially valuable, perhaps especially needed, during that present crisis.
Okay, bringing it home, verses 36 to 40 loop back to some very specific scenarios. He revisits the engaged couple idea.
Yes, the virgin he might be responsible for.
If the man feels he really ought to marry her, maybe due to social pressure, her age, his own desires, verse 36 says, he is not sinning, they should get married.
So there's practicality and compassion woven in. It's not a rigid no marriage rule.
But, verse 37, if he feels no such compulsion, has self-control, and decides not to marry her, this man also does the right thing.
And then the comparison in verse 38, marrying does right, but the one who chooses not to marry in these specific conditions does even better.
Better meaning more aligned with that ideal of undivided devotion during the crisis.
That seems to be the implication, yes. Better suited for the urgent times, less encumbered by worldly troubles.
But quickly, advice for widows in verse 39. She's free to remarry when her husband dies, but the condition is crucial. He must belong to the Lord.
Reinforcing that principle. For a believer, remarriage should be with another believer.
And finally, his personal judgment, again on the widow situation in verse 40. In my judgment, she is happier if she stays as she is.
Consistent with his overall preference expressed throughout the chapter, especially given the crisis context.
And he concludes the whole discussion with this little kicker, and I think that I too have the Spirit of God.
Yeah, basically saying, listen, this counsel I've given, including the judgment calls based on the crisis, this isn't just my opinion. I believe it's Spirit-guided wisdom for you right now. It adds weight to his advice.
Wow. Okay, so we've covered a lot. Marital duties, divorce complexities, the surprising value placed on singleness, this big principle of remaining in your calling.
And how that whole present crisis idea really shapes so much of the practical advice. It definitely makes you think differently about applying these verses directly today without considering that context.
It really does. So for you listening, what jumps out? Does this ancient advice on relationships, on singleness, on living faithfully in your specific situation, does it spark anything for you today? How does that idea of undivided devotion land?
Or the principle of remaining in your calling. How might that apply to your own circumstances, your work, your relationships, your community involvement?
Yeah, lots to chew on. And maybe that final thought to leave you with, drawing from the text. If you really took seriously the idea that the time is short and this world in its present form is passing away, how might that actually change your priorities starting today? Something to mull over as you continue your own deep dive.